Order!
O God, may your spirit and guidance be in us as we work for the benefit of all our people, for peace and justice in our land, and for the constant recognition of the dignity and aspirations of those whom we serve. Amen.
Colleagues, please be seated. Mr. Clerk, will you ascertain if the Commissioner of the Northwest Territories, the Honourable Margaret Tom, is ready to enter the chamber and to assent bills? Thank you.
Marcy, please be seated. Marcy, Mr. Speaker and members of the Legislative Assembly, good afternoon and good to see all of you. As the Commissioner of the Northwest Territories, I am pleased to assent to the following bill. Bill 11, Legislative Assembly Officers Standardization Act. Merci Cho. Thank you. Kwanani, merci beaucoup. Kwana.
Order!
Please be seated. Colleagues, I would like to extend the appreciation of this House to the Commissioner, Margaret M. Tom. It is always a pleasure to have her in the House. Colleagues, before we begin today, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge 3 of our statutory officers as they prepare for their upcoming retirements. Ms. Elaine Keenan-Banks was appointed as the first Information and Privacy Commissioner of the Northwest Territories in 1997 and has held the position for 23 years. Ms. Deborah McLeod has been the Human Rights Commissioner, with the Human Rights Commission since its inception in 2004, first as a Deputy Director and then as Director. Her retirement marked 16 years with the Human Rights Commission. Ms. Shannon Goldberg is retiring after 15 years of involvement with the Office of the Language Commissioner. Ms. Goldberg acted as legal counsel for the Languages Commissioner from 1996 to 2000 and became the Language Commissioner in 2005. Unfortunately, Shannon was unable to attend the sitting today, but we wish her all the best in her retirement. To each of you, thank you for your many years of dedication and service to the people of the Northwest Territories. Merci. Colleagues, please join me in thanking our statutory officers for their service and wishing them all the best in their retirement. Merci, Joe. Thank you. The member for Frame Lake has requested to address the House this afternoon on a matter of personal explanation. Mr. Riley, please proceed.
Monsieur le Président, I rise pursuant to Rule 21(1) of the Rules of the Legislative Assembly to make a personal explanation. During the debate on Motion 12-19(2), revocation of appointment of the Honourable Member for Great Slave to the Executive Council on August 26, 2020, I made the following statement, quote, "The N.W.T First Nation publicly withdrew their support for the SGP road on August 1st, 2020, given that the N.W.T contracted another Southern company for up to $20 million worth of work," end of quote. The N.W.T First Nation issued a news release dated August 1st, 2020 that included the following quote, "The most significant of these contracts was a standing offer agreement, which was recently awarded to two large multinational consulting firms," end of quote. I will table this news release later today. I've been asked to clarify my remarks made on August 26 by the Association of Consulting Engineering Companies, N.W.T, in a letter dated October 23, 2020. I will also table that letter later today. I will speak to the particulars of my remarks and not the merits of the Slave Geological Province Road, as my views on this subject are well known. I do not support that project. In July 2020, Stantec Consulting Limited and Golder Associates Limited were awarded standing offer agreements for the provision of environmental and engineering support services for the advancement of the Slave Geological Province Corridor. The contract values were $9.9 and $7.4 million respectively. Of the two firms, Golder Associates is registered for the business incentive policy. Both firms have offices in the N.W.T, Stantec for over 30 years, and Golder for 25 years, with a significant number of local employees, some of whom are expected to work on the Slave Geological Province Road. I apologize unreservedly to anyone who may have taken offence or felt to be misrepresented from my earlier remarks. I wish to thank the Association of Consulting Engineering Companies, N.W.T, for bringing this matter to my attention. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to correct the record.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Orders of the day. Item number 2, Minister Statements. Minister Statements. Minister responsible for the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation. Sorry, Municipal and Community Affairs. It's the wrong one here. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I wish to provide an update on the ongoing efforts of the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs to work with community government partners to support the COVID-19 pandemic response. We have all been affected by COVID-19. Taking action to slow the spread and protect public health has required leaders from all levels of government to act and adjust operations in order to continue serving the Northwest Territories residents. Since mid-March, MACA has worked with community governments to identify and monitor impacts to communities, share information about the government response to the pandemic, update community emergency plans, and ensure local emergencies and essential services are provided. Community governments have also needed to adapt. Practical changes have been met with creative solutions, such as holding council meetings remotely and making changes to bylaws and to do so. Mr. Speaker, these efforts have been supported in partnership with the Northwest Territories Association of Communities through virtual town hall meetings with community leaders that have happened since the beginning of the pandemic. Other ministers and N.W.T officials have worked collaboratively at these meetings to share information and answer questions that leaders may have about specific topics. I'm proud to say that these meetings have fostered engagements between our community governments, resulting in responsive made in the N.W.T plans that have helped to provide assistance and support the Northwest Territories residents. These include food hampers and on-the-land supports. MACA also worked with other departments to create multimedia communications about safety during the pandemic, fact sheets, and how to get help guidelines. Mr. Speaker, MACA continues to connect with community governments regularly to share current COVID-19 information, provide support with problems and issues they are encountering, to hear their concerns, to answer any questions they may have, and to provide a mechanism to feed their information into the government response. Currently, MACA is continuing our work with the health authorities, the Department of Health and Social Services, and to engage community governments to provide community-specific details and updates to community pandemic plans that reflect the capacity and resources in each community and region to support the health response efforts. Mr. Speaker, we want to share our gratitude and thanks on the ongoing efforts of the community governments, not only maintaining support for the residents, as well as their support for the government in maintaining isolation centres and border checkpoints, both on our highways and at the airports. On that note, I also must recognize the N.W.T staff, especially those who have put their hands forward to be redeployed to support these efforts. As the Minister for Municipal and Community Affairs, I want to echo an early statement by our Premier and take a moment to recognize them in the Legislative Assembly and say thank you. Mr. Speaker, we have benefited greatly and appreciated the collaboration and solution-based approach of everyone involved. We thank the leadership in our communities for their efforts and their cooperation. MACA is committed to continue working with the communities to share information, to listen, to respond to issues and concerns. We will work together to continue to manage the risk, protect our residents. Nothing is more important than the safety of our people. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Municipal and Community Affairs. Minister statements. Minister statements. Minister responsible for Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this year particularly has been hard for many Northwest Territories communities and residents who are already struggling to make ends meet. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought new economic challenges for some families in the Northwest Territories. In response to these concerns, the Department of Environment and Natural Resources is increasing funding this year to support harvesters and families going out on the land. 3 new programs will promote the sharing of land-based knowledge and provide training for the next generation of hunters and trappers. The Take a Family on the Land program will provide subsidies to Indigenous governments and organizations, community governments, and nonprofits to help offset costs for families in need to go out on the land. The Regional Harvesting, Training, and Mentorship Support Program will provide funding to regional Indigenous governments to increase mentorship opportunities and support land-based training needs. And the Pilot Trappers Mentoring Program will support trappers who want to learn trapping skills this season. Applications for Take a Family on the Land and the Regional Harvesting, Training and Mentorship Support Programs launched on October 21st, 2020, and applications are now being accepted. The Pilot Training or Trappers Mentoring Program will be launched in November. The Department also increased the amount for this year's grub stake payments. These payments are made to trappers at the beginning of the season based on the number of furs brought in the year before. Trappers use these grub stake payments to help offset some of the annual startup costs of trapping, which supports participation in fur industry. This year's trappers will be provided with more startup funds, and more trappers will be able to access the program. As a government, we are committed to supporting our residents to go out and land. During the engagement on the Environment and Natural Resource Sustainable Livelihoods Action Plan, we heard from communities about the importance of mentorship programs for beginning harvesters and trappers. We also heard about the need to provide support for families to pursue on the land activities. Each of these new programs draw on the strengths of the Northern tradition of land-based learning, mentorship, and sharing of knowledge. They support a number of actions identified in the Sustainable Livelihood Action Plan, including providing starter kits for new trappers, support for harvesting mentorship, and funding for families with limited resources to go on the land. The new funding for this season builds on the successful community partnership that has been developed through a regular program, such as Take a Kid Trapping, the Genuine Mackenzie Valley Fur Program, Community Harvest Assistant Program, Hunters Education, and Trappers Training. Mr. Speaker, we've heard from Indigenous governments and organizations about the importance of land-based skills and knowledge. This government believes that sustainable livelihood are vital to the prosperity of prosperous, diverse, and sustainable territory. Land-based skills and knowledge help ensure harvesters can access nutritious country food and that our communities maintain strong and resilient. Environment and Natural Resources remains committed to supporting the next generations of harvesters and stewards of the land and promoting sustainable access to country food. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. I'd like to also wish all my fellow trappers a very good season this year. I know there's not much snow, but I'm sure they'll make the best of it. Merci. Minister's statements. Member statements. Member for River South.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Could you atala si due kiluke o de kilunani asio aita zero de tataha. Do you have to atala nasi where portal is it your how to hayunten hati si your tsanan Could you be talking on? Hold on.
Checkpoint was initially set up at Enterprise. The reasoning, I assume, was to have something in place immediately. Eventually, with some persuasion, reflection, and evaluation, the COVID task force concluded that the appropriate location for the checkpoint would be at the border. In my mind, that was the correct decision then, and it remains so today. Mr. Speaker, staff, while at Enterprise, were in a position to travel home after each shift. This was not the case when the checkpoint was subsequently relocated to the border. The border set up with the addition of a portable camp sleeper and use of government equipment already on site provided an alternative for staff from having to endure a 1.5-hour daily commute each way home. The initial services, in part, were supplied by N.W.T park infrastructure and that of private sector. This appeared to work well with the warm weather where freeze-up of water and sewer lines were not an issue. Knowing that cold weather would be upon us and knowing the camp business, I provided the task force with a recommendation as to what would be required for accommodation at the border during the winter months. I suggested a 2-unit Texas camp, which included a kitchen, washroom, rec room, 6 single bedrooms. The camp would further require, of course, lighting, yard lighting, communication tower, power, propane, heated water storage, and heated gray water storage. All this could be set up within 8 hours. Mr. Speaker, operating a camp, big or small, requires qualified and at times certified maintenance staff to ensure worker and environmental safety. I mean no disrespect to the supplier of the current facility, which is made up of infrastructure more suited to remote mining camps that do not have road access. It is important that we provide our staff with safe and comfortable infrastructure while they work to secure our borders and keep us safe. Mr. Speaker, I will have questions for the Premier. Thank you.
Thank you, member for River South. Member statements. Member for the N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I talked in this House many a time about regards to sea lift to our communities in the N.W.T. Once a year, our opportunity for our constituents to order dry goods, supplies that they need to get through the winter season. And I'm really happy to say that the residents in our small remote communities, it helps them reduce the cost of the living and the high cost, brutally high cost of everything that's brought in by air. But I want to give where credit is due, Mr. Speaker, to our former ITI our former minister to our current minister, thank you very much for the work that MTS did this year. I kind of warned them at the start of the season that make sure we get into our communities and get what goods that's needed for the communities, and they did. They did an awesome job. I'm very happy again to say that 2020 sea lift season was a success, and I want to thank MTS staff out of Tuck and Hay River, and John Vandenberg, for instance, he was up in Tuck more than once, and thank him for the hard work that he's done, and important the N.W.T make sure our vital service and support to our remote and vulnerable communities, and they did an awesome job. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for N.W.T. Member statements. Member for Tunde Welde.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as an MLA, I regularly confer with leaders in and around my constituency. Very recently, having one of these discussions, an idea was shared about firefighting services, which I might share with this House. Mr. Speaker, this is an idea which my colleague, the member for Yellowknife North, and his constituents will appreciate, and I'm hoping they will support. Within the next 5 months, residents of the Ingram Trail will no longer have firefighting services provided by the City of Yellowknife. This has left much speculation for how this void of vital public services will be filled for the people on the Ingram Trail. Well, Mr. Speaker, here's an idea that will strike two birds with one stone. One, the N.W.T can help increase its capacity, training, and infrastructure at the existing fire hall in Detta. In addition, Malacca could contract all firing services for the Ingram Trail to Detta. Two, this will help Detta become more self-sufficient as a community and as a First Nation. And also, Mr. Speaker, it will also provide much-needed public services to residents along the nearby Ingram Trail. And this will relieve the City of Yellowknife and territorial government from this responsibility. Mr. Speaker, I think this is a very reasonable idea that will be a win-win for all parties involved. It will, however, take some time, preparation, and resources to achieve this, but time is of the essence. For example, Detta will need to assemble a pool of volunteers who will remain on call in case of emergencies. They'll also need more equipment in terms of vehicles and personnel, protective gear, as well as training exercises to ensure the best health and safety practices are being followed. And, Mr. Speaker, cost is always a consideration. What I do know that building on what we already have in place is far more cost efficient than like starting from scratch. So, Mr. Speaker, I urge our government to work with all relevant departments on this, along with the YKDFN and the City of Yellowknife to make this idea a reality. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'll have questions for the Minister of Malacca at the appropriate time. Merci, Chaud.
Thank you, Member for Tunde Welde. Member statements. Member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, for my member statement today, I'm going to talk about aftercare addiction services in the N.W.T. Mr. Speaker, as a mother, a former Denny leader, and now as an MLA, I have seen from multiple lenses the adverse effects that addictions have on people. I am very passionate about this issue because it is something which affects me directly. And because, Mr. Speaker, addictions affects all people, addictions affects all walks of life, of every family. Addictions do not discriminate based on skin color, social class, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, or language. Addictions are considered a disease, and anonymity is the essential part of recovery and aftercare. Mr. Speaker, during my previous leadership at the Salt River First Nation, the former Minister of Health and the present Deputy Minister of Health had a 3-day meeting on the delivery of addiction services to the North. All 33 community leaders, both Denny and Métis, were included in this meeting. And it was decided at that time that the external delivery was more effective because the terms required to treat these different levels of addiction were not available in the Northwest Territories. These teams include an addictions doctor, a clinical advisor, an elder, a psychologist or a psychiatrist, counselors and supervisors. These are very highly trained staff. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, I think the gap in addiction services in the N.W.T. is the aftercare component. Once a client comes back into the N.W.T. from the outside treatment centre, they go back to the same environment that they left, and it is very hard to remain clean and sober. I will have questions for the Minister of Health and Social Services. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Thabacha. Member statements. Member statements. Member for N.W.T. Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Indigenous languages are an important part of the N.W.T. identity, given that over 50% of our residents are Indigenous. Languages are vital to our Indigenous groups, and they signify identity and pride of our Indigenous people here in the N.W.T. Mr. Speaker, we know our Indigenous public service numbers remain low and have been that way for 30+ years. We continue to struggle in increasing those numbers for a variety of reasons. One reason I believe is because GNWT policies that don't have any teeth, and we lack the will to create policies that will actually make a difference in bringing those numbers up and moving away from colonial practices like cuts to vital programs because they don't measure up to somebody's measurements. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned, languages are important to all cultures, and we must make equal effort to promote and encourage language use. While I recognize our French language is thriving, I do have some serious concerns about forcing our Indigenous public service members to provide active offers in French. Mr. Speaker, I do not need to remind this House of the systemic attempts made by government policies in the past to strip language from our Indigenous people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and today I will have questions for the Minister responsible for languages.
Thank you, Member for N.W.T. Lakes. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the 1980s, Yellowknife was a prosperous gold mining town where only a handful of people did not have homes. These folks were known as the Bailey Boys, as Reverend and Mrs. Bailey cared for these souls with love and compassion. The downtown was bustling, commerce was thriving, and people felt safe to walk with their children on the streets. Fast forward 40 years, Yellowknife is the diamond capital of North America. The population has grown, and with it, so has access to money, designer drugs, and alcohol. The capital now plays host to a burgeoning population of people who are homeless, have addictions, and are in desperate need of help. As Northerners, we are prone to addiction. The roots of our addiction issues have long been linked to residential school trauma and abuse. This has created a multi-generational cycle of addiction that needs to stop now. We now know that addiction is often closely linked to childhood trauma. People are looking for an escape from their pain and turn to substances as a way to numb themselves. While sending addicts to a treatment centre in the South seems like a direct and forward approach to dealing with addictions, it is merely a Band-Aid solution if other pieces of recovery are missing. There are several phases to a successful recovery. The first phase is counselling. When an addict receives counselling, they are accessing assistance to take the next steps forward in their recovery. Counsellors help people to understand the steps required. And once people are finally ready to get help, there is a very short window of opportunity to get them into a detoxification program. An addict cannot enter a rehabilitation program in the South until they have sobered up. In order to board a plane, make the journey to a facility, whether it be in the North or in the South, they need to take this crucial first step in their path. In the Northwest Territories, there are significant delays to this critical step that often causes patients to withdraw their requests for help or to remove themselves from the treatment process. Once in a southern-based treatment facility, patients have access to resources to help with the struggle of addiction and oftentimes are able to move forward in their progress. However, the journey doesn't end with treatment in a facility. Once a rehabilitated person has returned to their community, access to a lifetime of ongoing supports is also required. This is the piece that is missing in the Northwest Territories, the aftercare. Culturally appropriate aftercare, such as on-the-land-based programs, ongoing trauma counseling, sober living facilities, online and social media supports, and sober event programming will help to establish a healthy support network for all Northwest Territories residents battling addiction. I will have questions for the Health Minister. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Great Slave. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. The problems with sterilization of instruments and equipment at Stanton Territorial Hospital will be known to members through media reports, health authority updates, and even calls from constituents awaiting surgery, as I've had. As the problem remains unresolved into its third month, it's time to step up with urgent action. The issue is as detailed as it is long-standing, but basically it's this. On July 23, the hospital's 3 sterilizer units simultaneously started producing instruments contaminated by moisture. This means that the instruments can't be considered sterile because moisture can attract bacteria. In a series of public updates issued July 24, September 14, and October 5th, the Health Authority has described efforts taken with the facility operator, Dexterra, Boreal Health Partnerships, Department of Infrastructure, and the sterilization equipment manufacturer. The number of sterile instrument packs produced has been increased, but there's no guarantee that packs are reliably sterile. The description of the measures being fixed or being used to fix the problem is basically continued jiggling of many factors that go into successful sterilization, varying instrument wraps and tray methods and sizes to the adjusting of machines themselves, steam production and delivery, the list goes on, all aimed at finding the perfect combination of factors or settings. What's being described basically sounds like a big experiment. Stanton has worked to stockpile sterile instrument packs for use in emergency surgeries and for some small elective procedures. However, the authority reported October 5th that 124 elective surgeries have been cancelled and remain unscheduled because no reliable fix to the problem can be predicted. What's at stake here is not the functionality of a technical system, but the health and even suffering of our residents. For example, delayed hip joint surgeries mean day after day of misery for patients awaiting surgery. I don't think it's an oversimplification to say that I've heard of no comparable situation anywhere else in Canada. We can't get this right, and does it mean that we will never have reliable sterilization at Stanton? I'll have questions later today for the Minister of Health and Social Services on an urgent solution to this crisis in patient care. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Kemlake.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've said before that a house is not a home. A home is a place that assures us safety, individual and community health, a platform for participating in community. It is embedded sustainably into the fabric of an emerging North and provides reliable comfort. The focus of a home, Mr. Speaker, is the person. Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights argues that housing is a human right that underpins an adequate standard of living throughout all stages of life, with focused attention on mothers and children. Article 21 of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples distinguishes the right to housing as an integral part of the Indigenous right to economic and social development, consistent with their unique cultural character in the context of self-determination. A home is not a big-box commodity available to those that can afford it. A home is fundamental to the dignity and worth of every human life that is free of poverty, underdevelopment, and discrimination. Housing must support and express the diversity and richness of our communities and cultures. Canada's 2017 National Housing Strategy begins with the principle that every Canadian deserves a safe and affordable home. Grounded in the principles of inclusion, participation, accountability, and non-discrimination, it is intended that housing programs should align with sustainable and accessible communities, climate change, the needs of the most vulnerable, and the values of Indigenous self-determination, reconciliation, respect, and cooperation. Mr. Speaker, the Northwest Territories is at a fork in the road, and it is time to prioritize housing N.W.T. residents. We need to look at the barriers N.W.T. residents face to access affordable housing. We need to actively set up partnerships to build housing, and we need to ensure trauma-focused client service is there to support the GNWT's efforts to house Northerners. Mr. Speaker, housing is a theme that permeates the priorities of this Assembly. It shows up as affordable homes and the reduction of poor housing. It shows up by enabling seniors to age in place with dignity. It shows up as the container for childhood development and as economic benefit retention in home construction. It shows up in the adaptation and transformation of climate change impacts. Housing is critical to building a North that provides a secure and healthy home for us now and into the future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Cam Lake. Members, before we carry on, I'd like to recognize Ms. Elaine Keenan-Banks, who is with us in the gallery. She was appointed as the first Information and Privacy Commissioner of the Northwest Territories in 1997 and has held the position for the last 23 years. Wish you all the best in your future retirement. Merci. Member statements. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I begin today, I'd like to thank the member from Tunaday-Welladay for raising the idea of DETA providing fire services for the Ingram Trail. I'll note this is actually from DETA to the junction as opposed to the Yellowknife Fire Hall to the junction is actually a few kilometers shorter, so it could result in a quicker response time. Also, the risk profile of a fire occurring in the DETA and the Ingram Trail at the same time is much lower than a fire occurring in Yellowknife and the Ingram Trail. So I hope the minister can get all those parties together and find a resolution for that. But my statement today, Mr. Speaker, is about something that has been mentioned in this House multiple times by multiple MLAs, and that's core funding for the SPCA, Mr. Speaker. And I think in one sense, core funding for the SPCA is the ultimate goal, but my frustration lies in that we've had dribs and drabs of funding in different policies over the years, and we haven't even got to the process where there's some sort of application funding for the SPCA. Mr. Speaker, presently it is not clear in the N.W.T who is responsible for animal welfare. There was an argument that, dogs and ditches is just municipalities. However, the work of the SPCA and the work of animal welfare is so much larger than that, Mr. Speaker. Rabies is endemic to Arctic foxes in the N.W.T. There is no way for us to meaningfully address rabies in this territory other than to consistently vaccinate our dogs. Public health has provided rabies vaccines in the past. However, consistently making sure they got out into the public has fallen on the wayside, Mr. Speaker. Our ENR Wildlife Vet does great work making sure anthrax outbreaks do not occur, making sure that we are tracking, as ticks move south, the possibility of Lyme disease, and I'm grateful for their work. But the ENR mandate stops as soon as it stops being wildlife. Climate change is going to make these issues more apparent, and I'm not asking for a lot. I'm asking for a pool of funding such that a very important organization can have some stability, and to make sure someone in the N.W.T across all these departments is looking at the issues surrounding animal welfare. ITI has part of that mandate if we are dealing with livestock or egg producers and the commercial aspects of it. And as we sit here in a global pandemic, and as we see the increases of viruses largely due to animal and human interaction, I think it's not too much to ask to make sure that there is someone in the N.W.T looking for this, and one of the key organizations who has long brought stability to this area is properly funded. Today, I will have questions for the Minister of Health on the public health aspect of animal health. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Member statements. Member for Detroit.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to speak about the exemptions of many of the medical travel patients and their escorts, which in most cases include families such as children. Many of the patients have to go to Edmonton to see a specialist for serious ailments, as there are not many or very few specialists in the Northwest Territories. Upon return to the N.W.T, they would have to self-isolate at a regional centre for 14 days. According to the document, thresholds and criteria for exemptions to self-isolate in a non-hub community for compassionate or exceptional reasons, the Chief Public Health Officer, after review of requests in relation to set criteria, may grant approval to self-isolate at home in their home community. Mr. Speaker, the document goes on to state that in addition to ensuring that there are clear, compassionate, or exceptional circumstances associated with an application. There's also a need to ensure that community leadership is advised of decisions made by the CPHO respecting exemptions. It goes on to state, this is not an approval, nor an opportunity for leadership to deny, but an opportunity to express concern or not of exemptions to isolate in their community and to be aware of exemptions. Mr. Speaker, this is good news for many of the patients on medical travel and perhaps alleviate their stress of having to be away from home for long stretches of time and then do the routine all over again after the next appointment. And there could be many more appointments. Mr. Speaker, a decision that is made solely by the CPHO, who does not live in the communities where there are concerns with people self-isolating in the community without submitting a coronavirus test result, is very concerning to the local leadership. Mr. Speaker, I will have questions for the Minister of Health and Social Services at the appropriate time. Masi.
Thank you, Member for Detro. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Mumford.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to talk about how we receive funding with I'm talking about billions of dollars, and it's very difficult. Sometimes it's really difficult to get a addiction treatment center here in our homeland. Instead, I'm going to talk about the treatment center.
Territories. Why can't we as a territory with our billion-dollar budgets find a way of providing residential addiction treatment here in our homeland in the Northwest Territories instead of spending $2 million a year sending people south? Mr. Speaker, our sister territory in Nunavut is proceeding with a new treatment center. That territory is using $25 million to leverage an additional $50 million in federal funding for a treatment center to be built in Nunavut. Furthermore, they've committed $11 million for training counselors because unlike the Northwest Territories, Nunavut believes in Northerners caring for Northerners. Mr. Speaker, the federal contribution stems from a call to action by the National Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Call to action number 20 calls for a sustainable federal funding for, and I quote, for a new Aboriginal healing centers to address the physical, mental, emotional, spiritual harms caused by residential schools, and to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that the funding of healing centers in Nunavut and Northwest Territories is a priority. Unlike the N.W.T, Mr. Speaker, Nunavut took the action seriously. Mr. Speaker, shame on us. Shame on us that we would take this so lightly, dismiss the recommendation of Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. And shame on us, Mr. Speaker, that we would so recklessly disregard the federal funding opportunity contained in the action, call to action number 20. Mr. Speaker, I will have questions for Premier at the appropriate time. Merci.
Thank you, Member for Mumfui. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Nahende.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Isidore Salmon Kutla was born September 20th, 1936 in Snake River, BC, and passed away on July 10th, 2020 at the age of 84. Isidore was preceded by his father, Charles Edward, his mother, Alice, his sons, Gordon, Frederick, Leonard, Emile, and his daughter, Joan. Sam was a very knowledgeable hunter and trapper that was well respected in the community in the Nahanni Butte. He was always able to provide good advice when asked. He had an open door policy and was always encouraging people to drop by and chat. Isidore is survived by his wife, Mary Bella, his sons, Brian, his daughters, Helen and Ellen, and his sister, Pauline Bertrand, half-brother, Frederick Burke, his great-grandchildren, Haley, Shauna, Destiny, Sean, Gary, and Tangris, Trevor, and Leonard. his Aunt Mary Detta, and numerous cousins, nieces, and nephews. The family would like to thank everybody for their kind words and for those who were able to attend the funeral from out of town during this trying time. He will be sadly missed by the family and the community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Nahende. Our thoughts and prayers are with the family. Member statements. Member statements. Colleagues, before we begin, I'd also like to welcome with us today the staff of Miss Keenan Banks, Lee Vipers, I hope I pronounced that right, Dyla Gray. Welcome. Also the husband of Miss McLeod, Ted, welcome to the proceedings today. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Minister responsible for Yellowknife Centre. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to introduce Ms. Deborah McLeod and her husband. They are my constituents, and I wish them the very best for their retirement. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife Centre. Members, recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member for Great Slave.
I'd like to recognize Ms. Elaine Keenan Banks as my constituent as well and congratulate her on her retirement. Thank you.
Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. For all those joining us today, welcome to the gallery. It's always good to have an audience with us. Merci. Reports of committees on the review of bills. Reports of committees on the review of bills. Reports of standing and special committees. Reports of standing and special committees. Member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, your Standing Committee on Government Operations is pleased to provide its report on the review of the 2018-2019 Northwest Territories Human Rights Commission's annual report and commends it to the House. The Standing Committee on Government Operations Committee has reviewed the 2018-2019 annual report of the Northwest Territories Human Rights Commission. The committee thanks Mr. Charles Dent, Chair of the Northwest Territories Human Rights Commission, Ms. Deborah McLeod, Director of Human Rights, and Mr. Sheldon Toner, Chair of the Adjudication Panel, for their appearance before the committee on June 1st, 2020. The Human Rights Act requires the Commission to prepare annual reports. These reports include information on the numbers and grounds of complaints filed. The Speaker tables the report in the Legislative Assembly. Once tabled, committee reviews the report. The Commission's 2018-2019 report highlighted its focus on accessibility and outreach. It also addressed recent changes made to the Human Rights Act. The Commission's work and recommendations are reflected in committee's observations. In our report, committee makes recommendations to increase accessibility for persons with the disabilities to government buildings and information on the Internet. The committee acknowledges the unique circumstances of this year's review of the Commission's report. The COVID-19 global pandemic created challenges for everyone, and particularly those living in vulnerable circumstances. The committee noted that inclusiveness and accessibility are critically important in government responses to the pandemic. I will now pass my reading on to the member for Kamloops.
Thank you, Member for Thabacha. Member for Kamloops.
The N.W.T. Human Rights Commission is separate from the Government of the Northwest Territories. It is part of the human rights system set up under the Human Rights Act. Most legislation in the Northwest Territories has a cabinet minister responsible for the Act. This is different for the Human Rights Act. It says the Commission is responsible to the Legislative Assembly for the administration of the Act. The Assembly's Office of the Clerk is responsible for the oversight of the Territory's statutory officers, including the Human Rights Commission. The Commission's role is to protect people from discrimination. They promote equality through education, research, and advocacy. The Act makes it illegal to discriminate or harass anyone based on age, disability, race, color, ancestry, place of origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, family status, social condition, religion, political belief, or pardon criminal conviction. The Commission promotes the compliance with the Act, and they also monitor and assess how well the Act is working. Transitioning to a restorative approach. The committee has followed the transition of the Human Rights Commission to a restorative practice approach with interest. It began in 2014 with a comprehensive review of the Human Rights Act. This was followed by the 3 independent agencies of the N.W.T. Human Rights System, the Commission, the Adjudication Panel, and the Director accepting the review's recommendations. In 2015, the 3 agencies published an implementation plan for the Commission's transition to a restorative approach to human rights work. The restorative process moves away from the existing legal and confrontational court-like process. Instead, the process focuses on the relationship between the parties and on resolving the dispute. The goal is to manage conflict and tension by repairing harm and building relationships. The committee supports the Commission's offering opportunities for settling complaints voluntarily through a dispute resolution process. During the public hearing, Director McLeod stated that the Commission started with the restorative approach early in 2017 and immediately saw a large number of parties participating. The Commission reports that 40% of all files closed in 2018-19 were settled through restorative dispute resolution. This is similar to 2017-18, where almost half of the complaints settled this way. Committee learned that in 2018-19, 60% of complaints went into the restorative dispute resolution process. This is a positive sign. It shows more people are sitting down together to work out their human rights issues. Organizational structure of the Human Rights Commission. When preparing the 2018-19 annual report, the Commission was composed of 3 agencies: the appointed members of the Commission, 5 individuals, the Director, and the Adjudication Panel, also 5 individuals. Both of the Office of the Director and the Adjudication Panel have support staff. Commission members are members of the public appointed by the Legislative Assembly. The Director's Office administers the complaint process, refers complaints to the Adjudication Panel, and acts as a secretary to the Commission. The number of parties navigating the system without support or representation was a key concern in the comprehensive review of the Act. The change to the structure of the Commission by combining the Commission and the Director's Office into one agency is part of addressing this concern. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to pass it to the MLA for Inuvik Twin Lakes. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Cam Lake. Member for Inuvik Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In March 29th, an amended Human Rights Act consolidated the Office of the Human Rights Commission and the Office of the Director into a single agency, the Human Rights Commission. With the amendments, the Commission gains a role in the complaint process by looking after complaints and preparing to bring them before the adjudicator. This is referred to as carriage of complaints. Complaints that cannot be resolved through the Director's dispute resolution process and go to the adjudication panel for hearing. Committee welcomes that the Commission now has legal counsel who can provide advice in the latter part of the complaint process. During 2018-19, Commission members and staff took a course on fairness as a principle of restorative practice. The Commission also held sessions for members of the adjudication panel. They also offered educational sessions and workshops on restorative practices to interest groups. The committee welcomes the Commission's proactiveness and preparatory work toward implementing the changes made to the Human Rights Act. The amendments will come into force annually over a 3-year period from 2019 to 2021. Focus on accessibility. During the 2018-19, the Commission focused on accessibility. The Commission's key achievement of the 2018-19 was developing an accessibility checklist to help make public events more accessible to persons with disabilities. Committee notes that the Commission's goal is to create inclusive hamlets, villages, towns, and cities by ensuring people are feeling welcomed in a way that respects each person's dignity. Accessibility includes physical access, web access, and access to services. It also includes social inclusion, equality, respect, and equity in opportunity. The checklist helps businesses and groups to identify if their services and products are accessible to all people. It also talks about how to accommodate people with specific needs. The Commission's website now offers a separate tab for accessibility. The webpage provides resources and links for improving accessibility to all services, including how to improve web experiences for users with disabilities, how to use plain language, and other ways to improve accessibility. It also provides information on legal rights for people who use service animals. Complaints on the grounds of disability. Disability is the basis for the majority of complaints filed. This is not just in the N.W.T, but across Canada. Disability includes mental and physical disabilities and can relate to hearing, vision, mobility, memory, or something else. During the 2018-19, 2/3 of all new complaints alleged discrimination based on disability. The rate was almost the same for the previous 2 years. According to the 2017 Canadian Survey on Disability, 20% of adults 15 years and over in the N.W.T are limited in their daily activities due to a disability. This is a large increase compared to 2012, where 8.2% of adults were limited due to disability. It is expected that the population with some sort of disability will increase, partly based on the aging of society. According to the N.W.T Bureau of Statistics, the population of seniors, those aged 60 and older, grew by 68.5% over the past 10 years. Nationwide, the territories experienced the second highest growth in seniors population, with only the Yukon having higher numbers. Seniors present nearly 15% of the N.W.T's total population. Aging increases the risk of having disabilities, and many seniors experience moderate to severe disability. I will pass the reading of the report to member for Yellowknife North. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Nuvik-Twin Lakes. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to speak to accessible designs for buildings. The committee heard the Commission's concern that many N.W.T businesses and service providers believe that the National Building Code sets the standard for accessibility, and that compliance with this code then allows them to meet their responsibilities under the Human Rights Act. The Commission says this is not always the case. The Commission held an International Human Rights Day event with the theme Accessibility in Yellowknife. Mr. Van Dyke presented on how the National Building Code affects him as a person with a disability. The Commission expressed much concern about limitations of full accessibility for all in the N.W.T. The Commission believes accessibility is one of the most important parts of building a healthy community. The Commission is concerned about the barriers that prevent full accessibility, including the lack of connection between the requirements set out in the National Building Code and what is actually considered an accessible space. That the ongoing update of the National Building Code will be completed soon, and that the National Building Code and the N.W.T include reference to the Canadian Standards Association Standard B651-18, Accessible Design for the Built Environment. For the coming year, the Commission will campaign on the relationship between the National Building Code and the Act to enable N.W.T businesses and service providers to better understand their rights and responsibilities under the Act. The committee recognizes the need for the GNWT to ensure that residents have equitable access to opportunities and services, and that standards and codes adopted in the NWT are consistent with legislation. Other options under discussion are that the GNWT adopt the National Building Code to have legislation that includes rules for accessibility. One challenge is that the code is part of the fire prevention regulations by the fire marshal. This could mean that accessibility is not a priority, as the code sets out minimum requirements for buildings that may not meet the requirements under human rights law. Committee agrees that NWT residents, builders, and building owners need to know what is required to make a building completely accessible. Committee also identified many points that are unclear regarding who is responsible for funding accessible building designs or renovations. It is not clear whether the Department for Municipal and Community Affairs would be responsible for retrofits, and if yes, whether this would apply to communities outside of Yellowknife or not. Finally, the committee wondered whether the G&W.T would consider incentives for builders to use building designs and projects such as small-scale construction, renovation, or retrofit programming that would provide the accessible requirements under the N.W.T. Human Rights Act. Consequently, the committee recommends. Recommendation 1. The Standing Committee on Government Operation recommends that the Government of the Northwest Territories investigate and take the necessary steps to solve the issues and remove the barriers that prevent the alignment between building codes and standards and the Human Rights Act. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will now pass the reading of the report on to the member for Decho.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. Member for Decho.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Outreach and digital transformation. The key task of the Commission is to educate employers, businesses, community groups, and residents about their rights and responsibilities under the Act. During the 2018-2019, the Commission reported that 15 communities were visited in person. 13 of these were visited as part of the community wellness fairs organized by the Indigenous Health and Community Wellness Division of Health and Social Services. Due to the pandemic, the fairs have stopped and outreach will focus on online activities. The committee commends the Commission on improving their website. This includes enlarged buttons and increased color contrasts to aid persons with visual disabilities. Other improvements include that documents and resources are made in an accessible format, such as MS Word documents. Now is the time for government to update its web services, focusing on online communication and digital access. The government response to the COVID-19 pandemic relied heavily on online service. Committee encourages the N.W.T to take this important step to open the doors to persons with disabilities. Examples of service standards for accessibility of electronic platforms exist in other Canadian jurisdictions. Regulations created in Ontario establish accessibility standards for customer service, including training requirements of staff and service standards. The G&W.T can make concrete changes that will make a difference. This includes ensuring documents posted to government websites are accessible for users who do not have specific software for reading documents saved in portable document format. Consequently, the committee recommends recommendation number 2. Standing Committee on Government Operations recommends that the Government of the Northwest Territories enhance digital access and inclusion for people living with disabilities in the N.W.T by reviewing current practices in serving the public and identifying measures to improve the existing situation with the goal to reduce the number of complaints to the Human Rights Commission on the grounds of disabilities. Mr. Speaker, I will now pass the report to MLA for Tabacha. Merci.
Thank you, member for Decho. Member for Tabacha.
This concludes the Standing Committee on Government Operations report on the N.W.T. Human Rights Commission 2018-2019 annual report. Recommendation number 3. The Standing Committee on Government Operations recommends that the Government of the Northwest Territories provide a response to the recommendations contained in this report within 120 days. Mr. Speaker, I move, second by the Honourable Member for Cam Lake, that Committee Report 4-19, bracket 2, Standing Committee on Government Operations report on the review of the 2018-2019 Northwest Territories Human Rights Commission annual report be received by the Assembly and moved into Committee of the Whole for consideration. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Tabacha. Thank you, members. Motion is in order to the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Any abstentions? Motion's carried. The report will be moved into the Committee of the Whole. Reports of standing and special committees. Member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, your Standing Committee on Government Operations is pleased to provide its report on the review of the 2018-2019 Annual Report of the Information and Privacy Commissioner of the Northwest Territories and commends it to this House. The Information and Privacy Commissioner is an officer of the Legislative Assembly. The IPC operates independently of the Government of the Northwest Territories. The IPC reports to the Legislative Assembly. They provide oversight and enforcement of the government's duties under the Access to Information and Protection of Privacy, ATIP Act. The IPC plays a similar role under the Health Information Act, HIA. The ATIP Act promotes government accountability. It balances the public's right to access information that government holds, while protecting people's privacy rights. People can make a complaint to the IPC about access to or disclose of information. The IPC will investigate, mediate, or resolve these complaints. They also comment on privacy issues in proposed laws. The IPC also educates people about their rights. Under the ATIP Act, the IPC files an annual report on our activities. This report can include recommendations. The IPC has duties under the Health Information Act. This legislation applies to collecting, using, and protecting and disclosing personal health information. It applies to health information records. This includes both public and private health practitioners. The Health Information Act requires the IPC file an annual report. This report includes the IPC's activities under the HIA. They can also include recommendations made by the IPC that the government did not follow. It can also include recommendations or comments on the Act. The Speaker tabled the 2018-2019 annual report of the Information Privacy Commissioner on December the 11th, 2019. On May 27, 2020, the Standing Committee on Government Operations met with IPC to review a report. This is the committee's report of that review. In 1997, the Assembly appointed Elaine Keelan-Banks as the first IPC. After 4 reappointments, Ms. Keenan-Banks will retire on October 30th, 2020. This makes her the longest-serving IPC in Canada. During her time, much has changed in how our government collects and uses information. This is also true for the technology used to process and hold that information. Ms. Keenan-Banks has served the people of the Northwest Territories well. She has been an advocate for both access to information and protection of privacy. The committee recognized Ms. Keenan-Banks' service and wishes her the best in her retirement. I will now pass the reading on to the MLA for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Member for Thabacha. Member for Cam Lake.
Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act. The ATIP Act applies to N.W.T departments. It also applies to most government boards and agencies. The Act states that public records must be accessible. It also requires the N.W.T to protect personal information. The Act states how the public can access N.W.T records, and it also includes rules about how the N.W.T collects, uses, and discloses information to protect people's privacy. The Act states that the N.W.T should only collect the information it needs to deliver a program. The ATIC Act overrules over other laws unless those laws otherwise say. Providing access to information is the starting point of the Act. There are limited exceptions where the N.W.T can refuse to provide access. These exceptions are to protect individuals' privacy, private business information, and advice to Cabinet. In her opening remarks to committee, the IPC noted that in 2018-19, most files involved access to information. She told committee that 30 of 55 files opened under the ATIP-related access to information. In 8 of these files, the public body had failed to respond to an access request within the required time period. There were 14 files opened on privacy breaches, and the IPC issued 18 review reports. She summarizes these in her report. Health Information Act. The Health Information Act, or HIA, covers the collection, use, disclosure, and protection of personal information. The legislation applies to health records under the control of health practitioners such as doctors or pharmacists. The Act says health practitioners should only have access to information they need to provide care. The Act assumes a person seeking health care has consented to the collection, use, or disclosure of their health information. However, the practitioners must believe that the patient understands how their information will be collected, used, and disclosed. The HIA gives patients the right to access their own health records. The N.W.T can charge a fee to copy health records. If someone believes their records were wrongly collected, used, or disclosed, they can ask the IPC for a review. This applies to complaints about both access and privacy issues. The Act requires health practitioners to tell you if the IPC if the privacy of your health information has been breached. In 2018-19, the IPC opened 29 files under the HIA. Of these, 18 were breach of privacy notifications. While most were minor breaches, the media reported on 2 breaches. The first was a theft of a laptop containing health information of 40,000 N.W.T residents. The second was mental health and addictions records found at the Fort Simpson dump. Noting the public concerns about these events, the IPC stated that awareness of privacy matters is on the increase and senior management is working toward improvement. Mr. Speaker, I will now pass over to member for Inuvik Twin Lakes. Thank you.
Thank you, member for Cam Lake. Member for Inuvik Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Public hearing. During the review, Standing Committee had good discussion with the IPC. They discussed both the ATIP Act and the HIA. They spoke about how the N.W.T meets their duties under these acts. Committee is making recommendations in the following areas. When recent changes to the ATIP Act will take effect, the IPC noted that it had been a year since the Assembly had amended the ATIP Act. However, the changes to the ATIP Act have not yet taken effect. Committee has not received an update from the N.W.T on when the changes will take effect. As a result, committee recommendation number 1, the Standing Committee on Government Operations recommends that the N.W.T provide an update on the work being done to bring into force the amended sections of the ATIP Act, including a schedule indicating when the changes will take effect. One major change to the ATIP Act is it will apply to municipalities. The committee in the 18th Assembly recommended that the Departments of Justice and Municipal and Community Affairs, MACA, develop a detailed plan to guide the implementation for ATIP for municipalities. In response, Justice and MACA said that they would develop draft terms of reference for a working group. This group would include municipal leaders and administrators. The N.W.T agreed to share the draft plan with committee for input. Committee notes that the concerns of some municipalities about the cost associated with ATIP. Municipalities have asked if ATIP will apply to older records or on a go-forward basis. Committee asked that information about this be included in the response to this report and that in the implementation plan. Bringing together ATIP skills. The IPC is concerned about the significantly increased lack of capacity within the public bodies to address access and privacy matters. In her remarks to committee, she said the timeframes for responding to ATIP requests are not being met and submissions to my office are significantly lacking in detail. She also noted exceptions are not well applied. I am seeing huge delays and failures to respond to correspondence from my office. The IPC believes this reduced capacity to deal with ATIP is the result of access and privacy knowledge not being highly valued in the job evaluation process. This results in pay levels being insufficient to attract employees with expertise. The IPC suggested the N.W.T needs a group of well-trained ATIP coordinators. She mentioned that there had been talk about centralizing the ATIP function within the government. This would create a pool of expertise and consistent application of the Act. Committee was interested in this approach, and there has been trend towards centralizing some functions in the GNWT. This includes financial and information technology services. Committee also recognizes that the Department of Finance provides ATIP administration for the Department of Executive and Indigenous Affairs. Committee makes the following recommendation. Recommendation number 2, the Standing Committee on Government Operation recommends that the GNWT investigate and explore options for centralizing the management and administration of ATIP on behalf of the GNWT departments. The Standing Committee further recommends that the government share the results of this review for committee input. I will pass the reading to the member for Yellowknife North. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Inuvik Twin Lakes. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was speaking to proactive disclosure. Committee's discussion with the IPC turned to the subject of open government. The purpose of open government is to make information the government holds easily available to the public. A person would not need to make a special request for information. This makes government more accessible and accountable. It could also reduce ATIP requests. The IPC noted that the benefits of government building access and privacy into programs, policies, and legislation as they developed. This process is called access by design, or proactive disclosure. It helps ensure that the ability to access information or protect people's privacy exists from the beginning. Committee believes that the GNWT needs to make a clear commitment to open government. As a result, the committee recommends, recommendation 3, the Standing Committee on Government Operation recommends that the GNWT update committee on work to develop a standard approach to including access by design principles into the design of communications, programs, policies, and legislation. Committee requests details on how the GNWT will formalize and share their standard approach with GNWT staff. Stopping the use of fax machines in the health sector. Committee and the IPC remain concerned about the use of faxes to share personal health information. Committee is aware this is an issue across Canada. In fact, our healthcare system links with Alberta may prevent changes in this area. However, committee believes the health sector must begin to adopt practices that provide greater privacy protection. Therefore, committee recommends recommendation 4. The Standing Committee on Government Operation recommends that the Government of the Northwest Territories develop and implement a plan for ending the use of fax machines in the health and social services sector. The potential privacy impacts of COVID-19. Committee questioned the IPC about the effect COVID-19 has had on the GNWT's response times to ATIP requests. The IPC said she had not seen any deemed refusals because of COVID-19. The IPC did caution committee about the pandemic's potential risks to privacy. She pointed to contract tracing apps used by governments. The IPC noted she had not received a privacy impact assessment on any of the GNWT's COVID-19 responses. Committee cautions the government to be mindful of privacy concerns as it responds to the pandemic. I will pass the reading of the report on to the member for Decho. Thank you.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. Member for Decho.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Conclusion. This concludes the Standing Committee on Government Operations report on the review of the 2018-2019 annual report, the Information and Privacy Commissioner, the Northwest Territories. Committee again wishes Ms. Keenan Banks well in her retirement and looks forward to working with the new IPC. Recommendation 5. The Standing Committee on Government Operations recommends that the GNWT provide a response to the recommendations contained in this report within 120 days. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Decho. Member for Sabacha.
Mr. Speaker, I move, second by the honourable member for Cam Lake, that Committee Report 5-19, Bracket 2, Standing Committee on Government Operations, report on the review of the 2018-2019 annual report of the Information and Privacy Commissioner of the Northwest Territories be received by the Assembly and moved into Committee of the Whole for consideration. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Sabacha. The motion is in order. To the motion, question has been called. All those in favour? All those opposed? Any abstentions? Motion is carried. The report will be moved into the Committee of the Whole. Thank you. Reports of standing and special committees. Reports of standing and special committees. Returns to oral questions. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have a return to oral question asked by the member from Montfouille on October 20th, 2020 regarding residential addictions treatment. It is a priority in the mandate of the Government of the Northwest Territories to increase the number and variety of culturally respectful, community-based mental health and addictions programs, including aftercare. I am committed to making this priority a reality. The member said that the previous minister and the current deputy minister made a promise to look into creating a Northern Treatment Centre. I have reviewed Hansard for that day, and there was no promise made. The deputy minister did say that looking at a Northern Treatment Centre is, quote, not off the table, end quote. That means there's space for Indigenous government leadership on next steps. I want to turn now to providing some background on facility-based addictions treatment in the Northwest Territories. We've had 4 treatment centres over the last couple of decades. The last one to close was N.W.T in 2013. Since then, the department has contracted 4 facilities in Alberta and BC in order to expand the range of options available to Northerners and reduce wait times to get in. The cost of operating N.W.T when it closed in 2013 was about $2.1 million a year. The current fiscal year budget for out-of-territory addictions treatment is $2.1 million, with an anticipated spend this year of $2.3 million. N.W.T was a 30-bed facility that offered a 28-day gender-specific program. In the final 3 years of operations, N.W.T operated at an average of 38% capacity. In its final full year of operations, 133 people attended treatment. In contrast, over the past 6 years since we started using southern facilities, an average of 228 people attend treatment each year. When factoring in utilization rates and the annual $2 million operating budget for N.W.T, it resulted in a bed rate of approximately $522 per day per client. In contrast, the department's current contracts for treatment range from $180 per day to $452 per day. The Standing Committee on Social Development in the last Legislative Assembly toured the 4 treatment centres. I was a member of that committee. We discovered the details of programming offered, and we met Northerners who were in the programs. In the small sample, N.W.T residents were most concerned about aftercare and about having choices for treatment. Mr. Speaker, about 70% of Northerners complete their programs. Looking to the next step, they wanted to know where they would live when they came back to Northern communities they came from and what services were available to support their sobriety. Our report and recommendations focused on the need for housing and aftercare. The department has started to bridge this gap in services. First, the department invested in community-based, on-the-land, mobile, family-based treatment and recovery. This pot of funding is now worth $1.8 million a year. I encourage Indigenous governments and organizations to apply for funding and create a program that is specific to the needs of their people. Funding is still available for this fiscal year. This program responds to the Mental Wellness and Addictions Recovery Plan that promises more community-based solutions for wellness and addiction recovery. Mr. Speaker, second, the department has strengthened community counselling options. Under a new approach, there is no wait list for counselling. People can get an appointment the same day. Third, the department is looking to work with communities to set up addictions peer support programs like Alcoholics Anonymous or Wellbriety to support people in maintaining their sobriety. Fourth, there are telephone supports through the N.W.T helpline and the Strongest Family Institute. Fifth, there are several cell phone apps and online options that will soon be made available to assist people who want to find solutions in their own home. We are providing a range of options so that we can meet people's needs wherever they are. We are also looking at prevention. Work has started on an alcohol strategy. The goal of the strategy is to create an all-of-government approach to addressing alcohol-related harm, such as reducing our high level of hospitalizations that occur primarily as a result of alcohol. There will be widespread public consultations over the next 2 years to hear from N.W.T. residents about what needs to be in that alcohol strategy. We are taking steps to develop a model for managed alcohol to decrease the harms related to binge drinking. The lessons learned in controlled distribution of alcohol through the pandemic are informing this work. The department is working on a medical detox model that can be delivered in the N.W.T. I recognize that addictions and recovery is an issue in almost every family and every community. It robs people of their health and potential. It is a disease that results in too many deaths. I want to change the story, and I know that the member from Montfouille does as well. I'm convinced that the path forward is to provide N.W.T. residents with a wide variety of supports to meet them where they are in their healing journey and to assist them in continuing on. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Questions asked by the member from Montfouille on October 20th, 2020 regarding Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations. I acknowledge the member's reference to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. Recommendation number 21 calls on the federal government to make funding a healing centre in the N.W.T. and Nunavut a priority. We are interested in the work that's going to take place in Nunavut to create a healing centre that is distinct from an addictions treatment centre. The department is constantly reviewing best practices in healing and addictions treatment, and if evidence points towards the need for a northern addictions facility, we will present that evidence to members and invite discussion. But as things stand today, this government has no mandate commitment, plan, or budget to create a Northern Treatment Addiction Centre. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Acknowledgements. Acknowledgements. Colleagues, I'm sure you're eager to get into oral questions, but we will return after a short recess. Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. We will now continue. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Mumfwee.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Speaker, I spoke about the addiction treatment center. We understand that there is a new treatment center happening in Nunavut.
Be that way. I refer again to the funding partnership that Territory has secured with Ottawa. And it's for $75 million treatment center in Iqaluit. It comes in the wake of Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendation. Mr. Speaker, what has our government of Northwest Territories done to follow up on the call to action number 20 of the TRC? Number 20 called for new treatment centers, more specifically for Nunavut and Northwest Territories. Where is our new addiction treatment center? Mr. Speaker, Mussey.
Thank you, member for Mumfwee. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Because it's on addictions, I'll transfer it to the Minister of Health and Social Services. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member from Mumfwee for his question. I think one of the first things to sort out is what is a healing centre and what is an addictions treatment centre. I'm not confident that they are the same thing. Not everybody who needs healing is an addict who needs to go through the process of detox and a 28-day program and the aftercare and so on. So I think the discussion needs to be broader. What is it that we want this centre to do? The Truth and Reconciliation Commission sees it specifically as a healing centre and commits to federal money for that purpose. So we're very interested in seeing what happens in Nunavut with their healing centre, what kind of lessons we can learn and apply here in the N.W.T. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Mumfwee.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, since Truth and Reconciliation 94 recommendations came out, more specifically on number 20 and 21, it's been well over 5 years. This government should have been prepared when the first TRC came out, what were the plans in place. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to know from either the Premier or Minister of Health and Social Service, what partnerships has this government explored with the federal government to follow up on call to action number 20? What have we learned from their neighbor Nunavut's very successful federal engagement in pursuit of their new treatment center for their territory? Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Mumfwee. Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I'd like to defer this to the Minister of Health and Social Services.
Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. Mr. Speaker, I beg your pardon. Mr. Speaker, it's my understanding that Nunavut, with a more homogenous population, put together a proposal and requested federal funding. That's not the stage that I understand that we're at here. I mean, I'm not aware that this government ever says no to federal money, but I've never seen a proposal for this healing centre. So I'm not clear where things are at. And I want to say that there's no reason that the N.W.T alone needs to take the lead on this. Indigenous governments and Indigenous government organizations could band together to create a proposal and work with the N.W.T on that, or not work with the N.W.T on that. So it's not only up to the N.W.T to make this happen. There has to be engagement and leadership from Indigenous governments. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Mumfwee.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Minister alluded to a proposal. She's waiting on a proposal. We need to be proactive as a N.W.T to engage with the federal government, similar to Nunavut. Nunavut's been proactive, and here we are. Are we going to be missing out on almost $75 million from the federal government? It's very It says, Mr. Speaker, I'm dismayed, I'm disappointed that we're at this stage. After almost 5 years, TRC recommendation came out, and here we are, still talking. We should be putting those into actions. And Mr. Speaker, I have a question on the Nunavut's ability to, I guess, secure the funding. How is it that Nunavut was able to secure $50 million in federal funding for an addiction treatment center, and we weren't, Mr. Speaker? Without delay, we should be approaching Ottawa for the same funding, Mr. Speaker. Merci.
Thank you. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Speaker, I have no detailed information about how Nunavut created a plan to get the federal government to provide money for a healing centre in Nunavut. I certainly could find that out. I want to reiterate that it doesn't have to be up to the N.W.T. Indigenous governments and Indigenous government organizations could band together to write a proposal for federal funding for a healing centre and to have some focus around what kind of services they want in that centre and where the centre will be located. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for Mumphy.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when we ask questions to ministers or premiers, I guess the longer the answers, the more questions that we create for us. So I have some more questions here, and Mr. Speaker, there's best practices already in place with Nunavut over 5 years now. Obviously, our territorial government should be working very closely with Nunavut to gather that information. I'm very surprised and shocked that our current the Department of Health and Social Service does not have that information at hand. Passing on the buck doesn't say well with me. We're representing N.W.T here. So I have a question to either the Premier or the Minister. Would the Premier or the Minister provide us with an itemized response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's number 94 calls to action, including progress made on each, especially, Mr. Speaker, on calls to action number 20 and 21? Merci.
Thank you, member for Mumphy. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what's truly surprising and shocking is that this issue didn't come out during our mandate priority setting exercise. Not a word about an addictions or healing centre at that time. The TRC recommendations are directed to the federal government. I understand that there is a role for all of us to play in telling the government what it is we want them to fund. So that is certainly work that could take place. And just to remind the member from Montfouille, I've been the health minister for 8 weeks. I've learned a tremendous amount, but I have not had the opportunity yet to learn about the Nunavut Healing Centre. But I'm prepared to do that and return to him with information. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions, member for Decho.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my member's statement alluded to the fact that the leadership of my community are puzzled by the fact that the Chief Public Health Officer has carte blanche, that is full discretionary power to approve the self-isolation plans of medical patients in order to return to the respective communities without any consultations or approvals with local leadership prior to CPHO granting the approval. I believe this process is also done for contractors that come from out of territory to conduct work in the territories, as the leadership have never ever been contacted. Can the Minister of Health or the Premier provide an explanation as to why the approval process does not include prior consultations with local leadership, considering we are in the pandemic? Merci.
Thank you, member for Decho. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as a matter of fact, the Chief Public Health Officer has the authority to accept or deny applications for self-isolation. She's mandated, of course, that people isolate in the 4 hub communities, and there have been questions about exceptions so that people can go to their home community and isolate. And I realize that that is the case in Fort Providence most recently. There isn't a process that respects the privacy legislation that allows the CPHO to contact the leadership and say, so-and-so wants to isolate, how do you feel about that? Rather, the advice that's given is that the individual himself or herself contact the community leadership, discuss their plan with the leadership, and achieve their buy-in as a way to ensure that the community is comfortable with them being there. The alternative is that they will, of course, isolate in the hub communities. Thank you.
Sir, oral questions. Member for Decho.
Mr. Speaker. There are grave concerns from my leadership that the virus could spread into our communities without a proven way to test each person for the coronavirus. There are confirmed cases in the Northwest Territories from people that have traveled out of territory. For the benefit of medical travel patients, which could mean a shorter stay at the isolation centre, and for the comfort level and certainty for local leadership, can the coronavirus testing be conducted on the travellers upon arrival to the N.W.T? Merci.
Thank you, Member for Decho. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's my understanding that the only travellers or essential workers who get immediate tests are people who are going into a healthcare setting, that other people do not receive those tests. And that is primarily a function of our capacity, that if we don't have people who are symptomatic, we don't really have a good test for them at this point. There is work going on to provide that kind of testing, which isn't really testing, it's screening. So that is coming down the pipe, but it doesn't exist now. The gold star approach would be that everybody who comes into the N.W.T. is screened to see if they have COVID. But unfortunately, we don't have the capacity to do that at this point. Right now, we're doing, our goal is in the region of 500 tests a week, and there are about 1,200 people a week who come into the N.W.T. So that's the gap we're looking at. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Decho.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. The Chief and Council of my community are upset that a nurse from the South is allowed to self-isolate at the local health centre where the residents of the community go for healthcare issues. I've also received another complaint of a social services employee returning from a visit to the East Coast and is currently back on the job at the health centre. And this is the health centre where all our people go for that are most vulnerable. There most likely wasn't any requirement for COVID testing. This again provokes the notion as to whether we are playing Russian roulette with the lives of the residents of Fort Providence. Can the Minister provide an explanation as to the arrangement for the nurse in question? Merci.
Thank you, Member for Decho. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to assure the member for Decho that we are not playing Russian roulette with the lives of anyone in the N.W.T., including the people who live in Fort Providence. It's my understanding that healthcare workers are in the exempt list, which means that they have very specific procedures to follow. They have to have a COVID test, they have to wear a mask, they are not allowed to socialize after work or leave the place in which they're staying. So there are efforts to bridge the gap between providing the medical service required and keeping the population safe from this person who has recently arrived. I don't have specific information on the Fort Providence nurse, but I could certainly obtain that and share it with the Minister for member for the Decho. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Final oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Nuvik-Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with my member statement today, this was no way, shape, or form about us against them. It's about equity. Our Indigenous public service are being told to answer phones while working for the N.W.T. in English and French. This has been in effect since 2015, when it was rolled out. a language completely foreign to them, at the same time not allowing for active offers in their own languages? Why are we as a government forcing Indigenous public service to answer phones in a language that's not theirs? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes. Minister responsible for Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just to clarify something right off the bat, if an Indigenous employee or any employee wants to make an active offer in any one of our Indigenous languages, they're not only allowed to, I encourage them to. I think we need more of that. So there's no policy saying that people can't make active offers in their own languages. And in case there's any question within the departments, the minister is telling them right now that is allowed and that's encouraged. The reason that these active offers are being made is that Section 11.1 of the Official Languages Act requires service in English and French. And active offers will let citizens know that they can receive that service. It's required in head and central offices, as well as in Hay River, Inuvik, Yellowknife, and Fort Smith, where the majority of the Francophone population is. Because when you go to an office, there's often signage. When you call somewhere, you can't see that there's signage, and so that's why that active offer is made in French. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Oral questions. Member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for that, as I'm aware of the training and the videos that went along with it, and there was never any part of saying that you could do it in another language. So, Mr. Speaker, will the Minister review whatever policy or whatever can be put in place to making sure our Indigenous public service that answer phones in French and English be removed, or be informed that if they want, they don't have to, they can answer in a different one of their own languages, for instance? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes. Minister responsible for EC&E.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and just to be clear that an Indigenous language can be added on to the English and French. We still need the English and French as part of the active service. But it was my understanding that during this active offer training, their employees were encouraged to answer in any Indigenous language they're able to speak, so I will look into that and I'll ensure that that's actually happening, because the member has different experiences or different understanding of that, so I will double check and I'll get back to the member. The official languages guidelines are currently being updated by the Indigenous Languages and Education Secretariat in ECE. I believe they were last updated in 1997. And so this is part of the Indigenous Languages Action Plan. And through that update, we're going to ensure that these aren't questions anymore, that everyone knows these, because that's the direction we want to move. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister, oral questions. Member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister, I get what the Minister is saying, but if I wanted to answer the phone as an Indigenous person in my government office and say, hello, Dringwinzi or Uvlami, why would I have to say it in French? If I'm saying two different languages, if a French person needs a service, if in my community, if the Muslim person, a Somalian person needs language, there is the service, translation service provided, they can request it. But what I'm asking is, why do we have to put our Indigenous people to have to say it in French when what's wrong with saying it in their own language? It's another language. It's giving an active offer saying we can provide service in another language. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes. Minister responsible for Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and there's nothing wrong with saying it in an Indigenous language. The fact is that the N.W.T is a public government, and Canada is a bilingual nation, and until Indigenous governments take over certain services and service delivery, those are the laws that we have to follow. And I don't think that answering in one language denigrates or reduces the value of another language. I know when I was talking with my spouse about this the other day, you know, she was saying her granny spoke many languages, and when I think back, my grandpa spoke many languages. You know, he's from Fort Chip. He spoke English, French, Chip, Cree, and I don't think there's anything wrong with offering service in a number of different languages. I think it's something that we can all strive for, as opposed to resist. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for N.W.T. Lakes.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I guess what I'm saying is our policies have no teeth. Our Indigenous languages have no teeth to say it's important. We have to add the French in. We don't have to add the N.W.T. We don't have to add the Chippewa in. We don't have to add all these other ones, but we have to add the French in. This is where I'm saying is why? Like, why does this, I get it that, but it's not, again, it's not an us against them. It's, if we're saying it and whatever, we're saying hello. If somebody needs a service, but why? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for N.W.T. Lakes. Minister responsible for EC&E.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the direction we're moving is that if you are answering the phone in a government office in a region where there's a number of CHIP speakers, then my hope is that in the coming years, there will be a requirement to answer in that Indigenous language. Wherever there is sufficient numbers of speakers, I hope that there will be a requirement to answer in that language. The same way there is with French in those 4 communities where there's a significant number of French speakers. So we're definitely moving in the direction that the member is talking about. And, ECE has the French Language Secretariat and the Indigenous Languages and Education Secretariat. And those 2 groups work very well together. The French language in the territory is strong. There's a number of French speakers, both natural-born French speakers and people who've come through the immersion program. And in response to that, the N.W.T. has really developed a robust French language service regime in the territory. And that is what we aspire to have, or that's what we want the way we want Indigenous languages to be delivered in the future as well. So the languages are working together. There is no us against them. And I know the member points it out, but I just wanted to point it out myself because it's often seen as us against them. It's a red herring. It seemed to be taking money away, funds away, something away from Indigenous languages when we deliver services in French, but that's not the case. The case is to expand all languages, all official languages. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions, member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Health and Social Services. Does the department collect and compile statistics on relapse and recovery? And if so, where these are available to the public and how are they being incorporated into departmental work? Thank you.
The member for Great Slave, Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what the department does collect is that people have finished their program. They don't go back to them to determine whether they've relapsed in their program. I will mention, however, that there is a survey that will go out early next year to people who have visited the treatment centres to determine what has worked for them and what hasn't worked for them and try and build some best practices out of those responses. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions, member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when can the public expect the department to create a comprehensive relapse prevention program, and will the minister commit to providing members with a plan for the new supports she mentioned earlier, including key performance indicators and timelines? Thank you.
Thank you, member for Great Slave. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at this point, we don't have a relapse prevention plan, and I'm not aware that there is work being contemplated for this. A person can relapse for a lot of different reasons. They are not necessarily programmatic, that something was missing in their treatment or aftercare. There are a lot of different factors that push people into addictions and pull them out of it. So what we're doing is a range of supports that is providing people with aftercare, with a way to hold on to their sobriety, I beg your pardon, but we don't have a relapse prevention plan that's called that. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions, member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what is the Department of Health and Social Services doing to reduce wait times for people who are seeking detoxification in order to enter treatment? Thank you.
Thank you, member for Great Slave. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what we recognize is that we need a model that is more widely applicable in the N.W.T. outside of the hospitals to assist people with medical detox. And so we are working now, the department is working now on creating a model that will make detox more readily and widely available in the N.W.T. For some people, of course, that's all they need, and they go on without formal treatment, and they are able to achieve sobriety. Of course, other people, that's a beginning step in a continuum of supports that would allow them to achieve sobriety. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that's great to hear that there's developing a model. It would be nice to have a time frame that went along with that. My last question is, will the minister commit to developing sustainable on-the-land and residential detoxification and treatment centres for addictions and mental health in the North? Thank you.
Thank you, member for Great Slave. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
I always appreciate the opportunity to plug our On the Land Healing Fund. It is $1.8 million annually. It is a very flexible program. People can use it for on the land individuals, aftercare, family-based treatment. It is allocated to Indigenous organizations. It's easy to get, and it is very much a community-based program where people can decide on their priorities and how they want them implemented, whether they want to hire staff and so on and so forth. So this is on offer to all communities, all Indigenous governments in the N.W.T, and I encourage them to apply for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Thabacha.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, would the minister agree that on-the-land programs could be used for a form of aftercare in the smaller communities and regions? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Thabacha. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm aware that Salt River First Nation had a very successful mobile treatment program with the Poundmakers Lodge a couple of years ago, and I think that that was really a model for the rest of the N.W.T about creating a partnership with a Southern Addictions Treatment Centre and bringing it north and bringing it directly to the people. So I think there's a lot of potential in that, and certainly I encourage people to explore that option for their communities if they think that would be useful. Thank you.
Mr. Oral questions. Member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, would the minister agree that some of the monies for the on-the-land programs could be used to hire and coordinate a program for aftercare once the client returns home? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Thabacha. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, absolutely, that is possible. One of the contemplated uses of the On the Land Healing Fund is, in fact, aftercare and family-based aftercare. So the Indigenous governments decide on the program. It is a community-based program, and they apply for the money to implement it in their communities according to their own needs. And so certainly the money could be spent on aftercare. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, would the minister agree, considering past problems, that external delivery of addiction services is more favorable for the client on the basis of anonymity, privacy, and the success rate is much higher than it was in the past? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Thabacha. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Yeah, thank you. As I've said, Mr. Speaker, in my return to oral question, N.W.T worked at a 38% capacity in the last 3 years it was open, and we've been able to double the number of people who get residential treatment for the same money over the last 6 years. What we understand is the hitch at N.W.T and other northern treatment centres is confidentiality. I think we all know that everybody knows everybody, and they don't necessarily want to restart start their sober lives in the NWT. We find that having options provides for a more responsive time to get in rather than longer wait times, which were the case at N.W.T. We also have gender-specific and co-ed programs. N.W.T. only had gender-specific programs. We also have locations in different parts of Alberta and BC and one in Toronto, so people can choose where they want to go. And finally, some of the locations are locations in which Indigenous values are the values driving care, such as Poundmakers and Thorpe. And so we believe that what we have on offer now presents a wide range of options for residents of the N.W.T. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for Sabacha.
Mr. Speaker, would the Minister agree and consider 3 standalone facilities for aftercare to be built, one in the South Slave, one in the Central Region, and one in the Beaufort Delta, to help clients who do not want to go back to the communities upon return for recovery centres? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Sabacha. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what I heard when I was on the Standing Committee for Social Development and we toured the treatment centres in the South is that people were most concerned with housing in particular. They wanted to not return to overcrowded housing, to housing over which they had no control of their environment. They were living on a couch and that kind of thing. What they really wanted was, a house of their own, or not necessarily even a house, but an apartment of their own. So that seems to be one of the key factors in making aftercare work, and there is in fact some language in the mandate about trying this approach to see if in fact it will assist people to return north, first of all, and to maintain their sobriety. Then, of course, the other thing we're doing is this survey next year and early next year to find out what's working for people and what isn't, and we certainly will make MLAs aware of that work so that they can consult their constituents. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions, member for Haverhill South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think the Premier and I differ on types of camps that should be at the border. She comes from a mining background, and I'm from the other side of the tracks, which is oil and gas. And we're used to something that's fairly comfortable. So anyways, I've been getting complaints and concerns about the accommodation at the border, and partly because it is a tent-type facility, similar to a Weather Havens facility. And I understand the camp will be there for the rest of the winter. So just to alleviate some of the concerns, I guess, by the people that are staying there, because they're talking about possibly quitting and not going back. So I just want to make sure that we address it before we get too far into it. The first question for the Minister, for the Premier, is my understanding from local service providers that they were never made aware those services were to be contracted out, camp services. When I hear concerns about questionable hiring processes and now the contracting out services, it makes me wonder who's in charge. So I asked the Minister, was the camp infrastructure for Highway 1 put out to tender? If not, why? Considering I made you aware of this well in advance. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Haverhill South. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I'll start with the first part of that because I heard 2 questions in that one. Who's in charge? Definitely, the buck stops here is what people have told me. I'm in charge of it. However, as the Minister responsible for the Secretariat, at no time do I micromanage. My direction to departments is not which contractor to hire or which person to hire. My direction to departments has been make sure the money stays in the north, that you're contracting with northern companies, especially during the time of COVID-19 and our economy at the slump. My other direction to departments isn't about whether you hire one individual or another, it's make sure you're hiring affirmative action candidates is my direction. So I just want to clarify that that's after that. Then my Deputy Minister, Associate Deputy Minister in this case, would heed my directions and move appropriately. So with the other question in the same question, which was was the camp infrastructure put out to tender? In this case, Mr. Speaker, it wasn't. There is allocations within our financial act that says that if procurement is under a certain amount, then you don't have to go through that process. I think that's just recently been changed, though, if I remember right. So in this time, time was limited. We approached a number of northern companies that could provide the service. We also asked for other companies' names that we thought could have provided. In the end, Mr. Speaker, though, we did contract with a northern company to provide the services for the camp, and because the camp actually, at this point, when we first put the camp facilities in, we did realize that we were 1 unit short. So in that case, we did contracts with a South Slave company who have agreed to put that camp in place. Thank you, Mr. So 2 northern companies. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Oral questions. Member for Haver South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Premier for that answer, and I'm glad that she's looking to companies out of Hay River, because there's a lot of camp shacks sitting in Hay River, a lot of equipment sitting there that could do the job. So the other question that or the issue I have is with respect to camp services, like you've got water delivery, sewer pump outs, you need diesel and propane delivery, you need snow clearing, fueling of generators and heaters, communication. So I'm asking the Premier, was or will these services be tendered out as well? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Haver South. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So a lot of those services actually were needed throughout the summer. We've been operating at the border since, in that area since COVID-19 came to the north. So a lot of those actually the services are currently provided by South Slave companies. And we're recently just put out requested quotes for snow removal, camp cleaning, and garbage removal. Again, we've asked those from South Slave companies. So more than just northern companies, from regional-based companies. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Oral questions. Member for Haver South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are dealing with electrical, fuel, propane, equipment. Some of these components require tradespeople when things go sideways. Are those persons, whether it be staff or contractors, qualified to provide the camp maintenance service, if there is even camp maintenance services available? My understanding is that we are expecting those monitoring the border to provide some or all of those functions. This just doesn't make sense to me, so I'm just asking the Premier, what the department is doing to ensure that those services are provided in a safe manner and that we got qualified people. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Haver South. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At no time actually should Border personnel be actually providing services such as camp maintenance, especially if we're talking about things like electrical and things like that. Those are trades that need to have skilled personnel. Now, I do know that sometimes people will go above and beyond and kind of help out with things as needed, but it's not a requirement, Mr. Speaker, and in fact, it's not even promoted. If it is a skilled trade, no one that doesn't have that trade certification should be doing it. So at this point, all of the camp maintenance is being provided by South Slave companies. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Oral questions. Member for Haver South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, for camps to be established in the N.W.T, in most instances, there are inspections and permitting required. I'd ask the Premier, was the Fire Marshal, WSCC, Health, Electrical and Gas Inspectors provided advance notice that the camp at the border was to be installed? For the safety of the employees, has the process for installation of camps been followed, or is it not required in this instance? And as well, I'd ask the Premier if these shelters that they have out there are not sufficient, will the Premier consider replace them with self-contained modular units? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Haver South. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The MLA is getting a lot of questions in these 4 questions. What I can say, Mr. Speaker, is that We don't actually go right to, when we have put out a contract, we don't go to the fire marshal, WSCC, health, gas inspectors, etc. We expect the contractors to do that, Mr. Speaker. Otherwise, we would never get any projects off the ground. So any contractor that applies on things is expected to have those in place. If there is a complaint or an issue that is concerning, let me know and we will check into it, because all contractors should be following the legislation and the regulations. And if not, that's a more serious issue than camp borders. What I can say, though, as well is I made a commitment to the MLA, and I'm upholding that, is that right after session's finished, I think it's mid-November, I've committed to going down to seeing those camps myself, recognizing that I am a diamond driller's daughter. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Oral questions. Member for Toonday-Welleday.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, and this goes back to my member statement on the fire hall in Detta. With firefighting, it's such a dangerous job. It's, all these guys, all these men and women put themselves in harm's way. Shout out to all their firefighters in the territories. Hard job, very hard job. And now with this news that with the Ingram Trail, they're going to be cut off with the services here in April this year, I imagine that it might cause some alarm for the residents. And, when we're here as MLAs, we've got to try to think out of the box, try to find solutions for our people. And, and I think this might be a good way to, if the Detta Fire Hall expanded, it might be a good way to serve the residents of Ingram Trail. So my question is for the Minister of Municipal and Community Affairs. And my first question is, Mr. Speaker, is will the Minister commit to have MACA explore increased capacity at the Detta Fire Centre, including additional funding for equipment, vehicles, and training? Monsieur Joe.
Thank you, Member for Toonday-Welleday. Minister responsible for Municipal and Community Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hear the member's concern about the fire services provided. Right now, the MACA is in conversation with YKDFN and looking at fire services to be provided. I will keep the member informed, and also as those conversations progress, we are looking at alternative solutions as well too, and we are open to doing things differently. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Toonday-Welleday.
And thank you for the response, Minister. Next question is, will the Minister consider contracting out firefighting services for Ingram Trail to Detta, since the City of Yellowknife has stated they will no longer provide services? Monsieur Cho.
Thank you, Member for Toonday-Welleday. Minister responsible for MACA.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This situation right now is quite complex, and I've expressed in previous that we do have similar situations like this throughout the Northwest Territories, where we have built up areas outside of the municipal boundary and outside of the community built up area as well too. But it doesn't stop the department from exploring alternative ideas and solutions. Right now, as we progress with the communication with the YKDFN. Right now, I cannot commit to offering further services, but I would like to look at the enhancement that is currently offered in Detta and looking at what we can do to provide adequate equipment and services for that community to respond to fires within that area. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Toonday-Welleday.
Mr. Speaker, and thank you for that response. And I understand, we're still early on in discussion stages right now. Like I said, it's early on in this idea is in its infancy right now. So let's see where this goes. I'm hoping we could move forward and have something positive come of it. But my last question, Mr. Speaker, is what issues will need to be resolved to get this idea moving forward? And will the Minister commit to meeting with the YKDFN to discuss this idea further? Mr. Joe.
Thank you, Member for Toonday-Welleday. Minister responsible for MACA.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Municipal and Community Affairs weighs very heavily on the communication and the relationships we have at the community level, and also with the Indigenous groups. Absolutely, I will keep the member informed and looking at what will progress out of the meetings coming forward, and looking at solutions to providing fire services. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions today are for the Minister of the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation. I'm wondering if the minister can explain how the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation calculates the core need income threshold, otherwise known as SNIT, and what programs use the SNIT to determine eligibility. Thank you.
Member for Cam Lake, Minister responsible for the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, the Housing Corporation does have a silly acronym, SNIT, but it is the core income need threshold for the Northwest Territories. But it is determined by zones throughout the territory, and looking at the specific needs for household incomes as well, based on household incomes, and also looking at the power, the water, the heat, and basically the utilities and the insurances for the core income threshold. I will be able to provide the member with documentation just to further explain how we come up with the calculations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, N.W.T. residents often identify barriers they experience in qualifying for N.W.T. Housing Corp's funding for home ownership repair or market rental programs as being related to SNIT. In some cases, due to the income targets under SNIT, seniors or people with disabilities do not meet eligibility requirements, even though they desperately require the funding supports that the GNWT does have. Will the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation conduct a review of the current SNIT to create a modern way of prioritizing Northerners for housing in the Northwest Territories? Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Cam Lake. Minister responsible for the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Housing Corporation had last looked at the core need income threshold was in 2015. We are currently looking at reviewing that, the core need income threshold for the Northwest Territories, and also for the seniors as well too. We do have a $1,000 deduction of the calculated rent as well. As I said previously, I will provide further documentation for the member just to further elaborate and explain how we work with the SNIT program throughout the Northwest Territories, because it does vary depending on jurisdiction. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for further documentation and also the willingness to review that. When it comes to public housing, Yellowknife is considered a Zone A community. This means that a person who makes a base salary of an MLA can live in public housing for $890 a month, that a manager with the GNWT is eligible for public housing for $1,295 a month, and a minister would pay a rent of $1,625 per month. And this is all found in the public housing brochure. So, Mr. Speaker, it's valuable to remember that Yellowknife also currently has more people on its housing list than the total number of housing units available in the entire city. So, Mr. Speaker, given the highest income identified in the N.W.T. Housing Corporation's rent scale is $8,334 and up, I'm wondering if there is a maximum eligible income for public housing in Yellowknife. Thank you.
Member for Cam Lake, Minister responsible for the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, looking at the core need for the Yellowknife area, and also looking at the minimum and the maximum. The minimum of core need income threshold is $20,000. The max is $100,000. I do hear the member speaking about, we do have high-income earners in public housing. Right now, the Housing Corporation has a number of 248 clients that we are looking to work with throughout the Northwest Territories and transferring them into home ownership. The Housing Corporation, as of right now, we are looking at our single-family dwellings in the smaller communities. They are up for sale, and we are working with our clients to provide programming for home ownership as well. And thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. My question is for the Minister of Health and Social Services. The problem with sterilization equipment at Stanton Territorial Hospital is about to enter its 4th month, and it appears we are tinkering away with settings and hoping to find a solution. I have to ask the basic question, why can't we fix this problem? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for that question. This is such a difficult issue because people are in pain waiting for this sterilization equipment to go back up to full functioning. So it's very difficult to say to them, we don't know when it's going to be fixed. What I can tell you is what you already know from your statement, Member for Frame Lake. These are complex issues. There are a number of different factors. There's the water quality, water testing for mineralization, the instruments themselves. They have had specialist, Stanton has had specialist repair people come up from the south to assist with trying to figure out what's wrong with the machines. And unfortunately, none of this has yet resulted in a full return to sterilization and a full surgical load. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that. And she alluded to the fact that, patients are left in ill health and misery, and we just don't have a way of scheduling surgeries yet. So can the Minister tell me how many surgeries are on hold and what other measures could be taken? For example, can we not ship sterilization equipment into the Northwest Territories, or other options to get people the surgeries they need? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's not as if there are no surgeries taking place. It's just that some surgeries which require larger instruments are not taking place. So as a matter of fact, since July, 200 surgeries have been completed, and of the 124 surgeries that were cancelled at the end of July, about 23 of those have been completed. So there is a need, of course, to address this big backlog. Some of the things we're looking at is whether it would be possible for people to go to the Inuvik Regional Hospital and have surgery performed there. We had been considering sending patients to Alberta, but unfortunately that is no longer an option because surgeries for Albertans are also being cancelled for a variety of reasons, including a surge of COVID cases. So the department has looked at the possibility of having the surgical instruments reprocessed somewhere else. They actually are going to perform an experiment in the coming week by sending surgical equipment to the Foothills Hospital in Calgary and to see whether the sterilization works in that facility so that they can identify whether the problem is with the instruments themselves or whether there still remains a problem with the sterilization machine. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that. A big part of the problem here, Mr. Speaker, is the uncertainty for patients that are waiting. Not only have their surgeries been cancelled, but there doesn't seem to be a solution anywhere in the future. Will the Minister see that regular public updates are issued? The last one, I think, was October the 5th, 3 weeks ago. Doesn't even seem like there's a regular schedule. So can the Minister commit to a regularly scheduled update of the NTHSSA website and some way of actually notifying individual patients about what's going on? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there will be a letter going to all of the patients awaiting surgery at Stanton this week so that they can have an update on what's happening there directly from Stanton. In the meantime, if they are having pain management issues, and I know that's very common with leg, hip surgeries, then they should continue to be in touch with their healthcare provider to have appropriate treatment for that, and that also can be done virtually if people are housebound. we want to expand the capacity, obviously, and we need to tell people when this is going to be resolved. Unfortunately, there is no specific date. All I can say is that they are working on it very diligently, and we can certainly commit to updating the website every 2 weeks to tell people what has been tried in the prior 2 weeks and what the results are. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that commitment to update the website every couple of weeks. I think that way people will at least have somewhere where they can get information about what's happening. The Minister herself talked about how COVID is surging in Alberta, and that might cause some difficulties in terms of sending patients there. The other concern that I've heard expressed is, of course, the impending drastic cuts that may be made by the Alberta provincial government to their healthcare system, as publicly announced by their premier. So what can the Minister tell us about these impending cuts and how that might affect our ability to get surgeries and perhaps even other healthcare in Alberta? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That question. We don't have any inside information. We have heard, of course, about the privatization being contemplated in Alberta. We've heard about the possibility of wildcat strikes. We've heard about the surge in COVID cases. I'm going to say that those are factors which will mean that there are fewer surgeries available to Northerners rather than more. And those are really issues that are beyond our control. So, you know, they have been helpful in helping us to validate the sterilization in their own machines, but as for sending people there, that seems like a more difficult proposition. And to be perfectly honest, those people I know who are waiting for hip replacements and other major surgery are not very keen to go to Edmonton for surgery at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During my election campaign, I naively thought I would have a hope in getting the N.W.T. SBA some funding. I'm now seeing that that is an impossible task, but instead of asking MACA about this for the 10th time, I'm going to take another run at it today through a public health lens. So my question for the Minister of Health and Social Services, Mr. Speaker, is what is public health's role in monitoring health risks caused by animals? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the member not leaving me out in the questions today. He was able to teach me a new word today, which is zoonotics. Zoonotics is where viruses and other pathogens can be transmitted from animals or insects to humans, so rabies would be an example of a zoonotic. So public health has a role in monitoring and responding to those risks when they're present in the population, particularly in investigating human illness that may be a result of a jump from an animal to a person. So the focus here is on the person rather than the animal. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is actually an appropriate day to talk about zoonotics, as the first dog in Canada tested positive for COVID-19 today, so there's a bit of an overlap. One of my main concerns in this area, and one of the great work that the N.W.T. SPCA does, is making sure dogs are vaccinated for rabies and making sure rabies does not then transfer to the human population. Presently, that is not being done in all the communities. Can the Minister of Health put together a plan to make sure we are having rabies vaccines in all of our communities? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's my understanding that there is a lay vaccination program in the N.W.T. that ensures rabies vaccines for animals are available to communities that don't have a local or resident veterinarian to administer the vaccine themselves. The big challenge here is getting people to administer the vaccine, and especially where there aren't veterinarians or other technicians who can do this themselves. So I know that there has been some work between Health and Social Services and my colleague at ENR to identify and train individuals to administer those vaccines, and I don't have information about how many of those people and in which communities they exist, but that's something I could certainly provide to the member. Thank you.
Minister, oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, that is exactly the heart of the issue. We presently provide the vaccines and they're free and communities can use them, but it's difficult to get someone to actually deliver those vaccines, and that's where the N.W.T. SBC really fills that gap. Another way that this has been done is multiple jurisdictions have hired or contracted a public health veterinarian. I believe we only have 3 veterinarians operating in the territory right now. Is this an option that public health has reviewed? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not aware that the department is looking at hiring a public veterinarian. We would certainly be working with ENR in the event that they are looking at hiring a public veterinarian, so that we can work together on making sure that zoonotics do not proliferate in the N.W.T. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Presently, ENR is a wildlife veterinarian. They do lots of great work. It's essential work to making sure the population and health of our wildlife is there. I now learn that public health has a bit of a role in zoonotics, and then MACA seemingly has some of a role, but seems to deny it consistently. So my question for the Minister of Health is it possible to work with those departments, see if there's some gaps here, and possibly create a funding pool to address them? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm certainly willing to have that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Excuse me. Colleagues, our time for oral questions has expired. Oral questions, written questions, returns to written questions, replies to Commissioner's address, petitions, tabling of documents. Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following document, follow-up letter for oral question 242-19(2), enforcement of Chief Public Health Officer's orders in apartment buildings. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Tabling of documents. Minister responsible for Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following 2 documents: Northern Employees Benefit Services, or NEBS, Pension Plan Annual Report for the year ended December 31st, 2019, Northwest Territories Carbon Tax Report 2019-2020. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister of Finance. Tabling of documents. Minister responsible for Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following document, follow-up letter for oral question 363-19(2), policing in Hay River and the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Tabling of documents. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I wish to table the following 2 documents. A letter dated October 23, 2020 from the Association of Consulting Engineering Companies to myself as MLA for Frame Lake. Second document, Mr. Speaker, is a press release dated August 1st, 2020 from the Yellowknife's Denny First Nation titled Yellowknife's Denny First Nation retracts support for the Slave Geological Province Corridor until the N.W.T. takes the action necessary to ensure that Northerners benefit from the project. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Frame Lake. Tabling of documents. Colleagues, pursuant to Section 68 of the Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act, I wish to table the 2019-2020 annual report of the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner of the Northwest Territories. Earlier today, I recognize the presence in the gallery of Ms. Elaine Keenan-Banks, the Information and Privacy Commissioner. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, Ms. Keenan-Banks, for this, the last tabling of your annual report as you embark on retirement. Best of wishes on behalf of all members of this Assembly. Merci. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Notice is a motion. Notice is a motion. Motions. Motions. Notice is a motion for first reading of bills. Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I give notice that on Thursday, October 29th, 2020, I will move that Bill 15, Miscellaneous Statute Law Amendment Act 2020, be read for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Notice is a motion for first reading of bills. Notice is a motion for first reading of bills. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration in Committee of the Whole of Bills and Other Matters, Table Document 165-19 brackets 2. Table Document 166-19 brackets 2. Table Document 167-19 brackets 2. Table Document 181-19 brackets 2. With also Committee Report 4-19 brackets 2, Committee Report 5-19 brackets 2 with member for Nuvik Twin Lakes signature.
I will now call Committee of the Whole to order. What is the wish of committee? Mr. Norton?
He wishes to deal with Table Document 1A1-19 bracket 2, Capital Estimates 2021-2022, and deal with the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Does committee agree? Agree. Thank you, committee. We'll take a short recess and resume with the first item. Committee, I will call committee back to order. And we have agreed to resume consideration of table document 18119 brackets 2, capital estimates 2020-2021 with the Department of Environment and Natural Resource. Mr. Minister, do you wish to bring any witnesses in? Yes. Escort the witness to the chamber. Would the minister please introduce his witnesses?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Deputy Minister Aaron Kelly, Director of Finance and Capital Planning, Jessica St. Arno. Jessica St. Arno. Just go R.no.
Okay. Welcome. Committee has agreed to forego general comments, so is committee, if committee agrees, we'll proceed to the detail contained in the table document. Committee, we will defer the departmental totals and review the estimates by activity summary beginning at page 16 with information items on page 17. Members, do we have any comments? Seeing no comments, I will call the activity Environment, Natural Resource, Corporate Management, Infrastructure, Investments $399,000. Does committee agree? We will now turn to Environmental Protection and Waste Management on page 18 with information items on page 19. Committee, do we have any comments under this activity? Seeing none, I will now call the activity Environment and Natural Resources, Environmental Protection and Waste Management, Infrastructure Investment, $399,000. Does committee agree? We will now turn to Forest Management on page 21 with information items on page 22. Are there any comments? Member for Trinidad-Willowday.
Madam Chair, I want to thank the Minister and his staff this summer. We had a tour of the forestry facility there, and during the tour, there was a commitment there to have a couple of forestry vehicles on there. I don't see anything on this listing. I just wanted to see where that commitment stands. Masicho.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, MLA Norn was correct. We did have the opportunity to meet with him in Fort Res. The project, or the two trucks that we're talking about, one was already there, the new one's already there. The other one is being processed this year. It's under $50,000, so we're purchasing it through O&M, and it will be done this fiscal year. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Trinidad-Willowday, any further comments?
Thank you, Madam Chair. No, I'm very pleased to hear that, and I'm very happy to see the Minister and staff follow through on the commitment and get it done. Masicho.
Thank you, Member. Are there any other comments for this section? Seeing none, I will now call the activity Environment and Natural Resource, Forest Management, Infrastructure Investments, $679,000. Does committee agree? We will now turn to Wildlife and Fish on page 23 with information items on page 24. Are there any comments under this activity? Seeing none, I will call the activity Environment, Natural Resources, Wildlife and Fish Infrastructure Investment, $682,000. Does committee agree? Thank you. Members, please return now to the department summary found on page 15. Environment, Natural Resources, 2021-2022 capital estimates. Oops. I find my page. $2,159,000. Does committee agree? Oh. Just 1 second. Mr. Norn.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I move that the committee defer further consideration of the estimates for the Department of Environment and Natural Resources at this time. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Norn. The motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All in favor? All opposed? The motion is carried. Consideration of the departmental summary has been deferred. Thank you to the Minister and the witnesses. Sergeant at Arms, you may escort the witnesses out of the chamber. Mr. Norm, what is the will of committee?
Yeah, Madam Chair, I move that the chair rise and report progress.
Thank you. The motion is in order and is non-debatable. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion is carried. I will now rise and report progress.
I have the report of the Committee of the Whole, please. Member for New-Victory Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, your committee has been considering table document 181-19-2, capital estimates 2020-2021, and would like to report progress with one motion passed. And Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the Committee of the Whole be concurred with. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have a seconder? Member for Nahende. All those in favor? All those opposed? Any abstentions? Motion's carried. Report of Committee of the Whole. Oops, sorry. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Mr. Clerk, orders of the day.
Orders of the day for Wednesday, October 28th, 2020, 1:30 p.m. Prayer, minister statements, member statements, returns to oral questions, recognition of visitors in the gallery. Acknowledgements, oral questions, returns to written questions, replies to Commissioner's address, reports of committees on the review of bills, reports of standing and special committees, petitions, tabling of documents, notices of motion, motions, notices of motion for first reading of bills, First reading of bills, Bills 12, 13, and 14. Second reading of bills, consideration in committee of the whole of bills and other matters. Table documents 165, 166, 167, and 181-19-2. Committee report 4-19-2 and committee report 5-19-2. Report of committee of the whole, third reading of bills, orders of the day.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. This House stands adjourned until Wednesday, October 28th, 2020 at 1:30 p.m.